One summer afternoon in 2016, a young woman squeezed into the tiny bathroom on board a fishing vessel. She locked the door behind her and leaned in close to the mirror to get a good look at her face, in particular her left eye, which was disturbingly red. She used both hands to stretch the skin back around her eye, and the tissue along the edge of her eyelid looked totally strange. So she just ran a finger along it, and then suddenly something dislodged from her eye. It was this small sliver of fuzz, about the size and thickness of a carpet fiber. The woman leaned in closer to the mirror and delicately pinched this weird strand and pulled it away from her eye. She held it up to the bathroom light, trying to figure out what it was, and to her surprise, it was almost half an inch long. As she stood there wondering how on earth this weird piece of fiber had gotten wedged in her eye, something strange happened. The little strand began to move. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, the next time you're with the follow button at the beach, anytime they get up to go in the water, kick a little bit of sand into their open drink. This episode is called It Moves. 26-year-old Abby Beckley perched high in her saddle and spurred her horse into a gallop. She savored the feeling of the wind on her cheeks as she galloped across the pasture towards the stable. Abby had spent the first half of the summer of 2016 renting a room at a converted cattle ranch in Gold Beach, Oregon. She spent her days riding horses and exploring the coast. It was only a half-hour north from where she grew up, so it was a familiar landscape. But being out in nature never got old to Abby. She tried to spend the majority of every summer outside, soaking up the sunshine. This August afternoon was her last day at the cattle ranch. She was ready for a new adventure, and tomorrow she was traveling to Alaska to work as a deckhand on a commercial salmon fishing boat. She'd never been out to sea longer than a few days, but Abby was always game to expand her horizons and try new things. Abby pulled on the reins for the horse to stop, then she dismounted and walked the horse into the stable. Once it was in its stall, Abby latched the gate and then walked down the row of other stalls, saying her goodbyes to the other horses. At the end of the aisle was the ranch's one remaining cow, munching hay all alone. Abby gave the cow a little rub on her nose, then she closed the stable door and headed off for her next adventure in Alaska. The next day, Abby took 2 planes and a taxi before arriving in the small town of Craig, Alaska, where her boat was docked. As she walked down the street, she could tell she'd entered a whole new world. The woods on the mountainside were thick and unbroken. The peaks rising above her were snow-capped, even in summer. And the air was crisp in a way she'd never felt before. Abby headed down to the waterfront and saw her boat docked in the harbor. Her first thought was that it looked smaller than it did in the pictures she'd seen. But the crew members who greeted her were warm and welcoming, and one of them led Abby to her bunk and helped her get settled. She was happy to be there and excited for what lay ahead. The next morning, the whole crew had arrived, and once supplies were loaded, the fishing vessel pulled away from shore and headed across the bay towards the open ocean. Right away, it was time for Abby to get to work. She was paired with another young woman named Allison, who was a regular crew member who showed Abby how to work with the other deckhands to cast out the big weighted nets called seines. It was a tricky process. Abby had to help fling the enormous net into the waves with one hand while gripping a rope to drag it back in with the other hand. Also, the net tangled very easily and was surprisingly heavy once it got wet. Abby's first morning was exhausting. Waves kept splashing up on the deck, soaking her and making her shake with cold. Even though it was summer, the wind that whipped across the water had a bite to it. Over the next few days, Abby's mentor, Allison, taught her everything she could about working on a commercial fishing boat. Allison showed Abby how to sort the fish by weight, how to stack them neatly in coolers of ice for sale back on the mainland, how to swab the deck, how to clean the knives and hooks and nets, which were always getting soaked in fish blood and bait. And so Abby came to learn that life at sea was both messy and dangerous. But it was worth it. On Abby's first Friday night on the boat, the crew grilled a festive dinner on the deck and watched the sunset together. At that moment, Abby realized that there was nowhere else in the world she'd rather be. This was awesome. After dinner, Abby helped clean up in the kitchen, and then she flopped down on her bunk. Abby listened to the sound of the waves outside and started to nod off, but she was distracted by an odd itch in her left eye. She wondered if it was a grain of sand or maybe a fragment of barnacle from the nets. So she rolled out of bed, went down the hall to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on her face. Abby tried to blink to kind of clean her left eye. Then she patted her face dry and went back to her bunk. She needed to get some sleep. Tomorrow was going to be another very long day of work. The next morning, Abby's left eye was still bothering her, only now she had a headache too. She went back to the bathroom and looked at her eye again, and now she could see it was red and inflamed. Abby decided she would just ignore it for now and get on with her chores. There were fish to be caught. 5 days later, Abby stood on the deck trying to work through her discomfort. She still wasn't feeling any better. Her headaches had grown from mild to full-blown migraines, and even worse, her left eyelid was now starting to droop, which made it hard for her to open her eye all the way. At breakfast that morning, Abby's mentor, Allison, asked her if she was okay, and Abby said that she was uncomfortable, but what was going on with her was probably just a stubborn case of pink eye. Fortunately, their boat was scheduled to return to the town of Craig that afternoon for a short stay to offload fish, restock supplies, and give the crew some time off. Abby decided that it was time to face the facts here, that whatever was going on with her eye and her headache was likely not going to go away on its own. She needed medical intervention. So once the boat pulled into the harbor, Abby helped tie it to the pier. Most of the crew went into town to buy supplies, do laundry, and enjoy a day on land, but Abby went back onto the boat and down the hall to the bathroom. Her eye was really hurting at this point, and so she wanted to look one more time before she went on land to go find a doctor. Abby went into the bathroom, locked the door behind her, took a deep breath, and then faced herself in the mirror. And when she saw her eye, she could tell it was in really bad shape. She couldn't imagine how she looked to her crewmates. Abby ran her finger along her eyelid to see if maybe she could find some foreign object in her eye that was causing so much irritation. And then a moment later, as she was kind of rubbing her finger around her eye, she actually felt something that was kind of small and thin, and she managed to pull it out of her eye. And when she did, Abby immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Now that she'd found whatever foreign object was in her eye, she thought maybe she would start to feel better. But when she got a good look at this thing she had pulled from her eye, she screamed. Pinched between her fingers, writhing around, was a half-inch long worm. Her first instinct was to throw it in the toilet. Her second was to throw up. Instead, she ran down the hall to Allison's door, barged inside, and showed her this worm she had pulled from her eye. Allison's jaw dropped. She told Abby that she'd worked on a lot of boats over the years and seen some strange things, but nothing like this. Allison asked if Abby had handled any infected-looking fish while cleaning the nets. Maybe this worm was actually some sort of maggot. But just the idea of finding fly larvae in her eye made Abby immediately sick to her stomach. And so she threw this little worm into Allison's trash can, then she sat on her bed and tried not to hyperventilate. Allison flipped open her computer and Googled salmon worms. Abby looked over her shoulder as they scanned the results. They existed, but there was no mention of them in connection with humans. Allison told Abby she really had to go see a doctor. The boat wasn't going back out to sea for 24 hours, so Abby had time. Hopefully there was some kind of medication they could give her. Abby went to the ship's galley where they kept a folder of emergency contacts and found the number of an urgent care clinic in town. Abby called, explained her situation, and then booked their next available appointment, which was early the next morning. Then Abby went back to her bunk and did her best not to totally freak out about the situation she was in. However, every time she began to doze off, something would wiggle around inside of her eye, and she'd bolt awake with her heart thumping. The next morning, Abby sat in the small clinic waiting area, tapping her feet nervously. She had arrived early after a terrible night's sleep. Her left eye was totally bloodshot and swollen, and her eyelid was drooping worse than ever. A few minutes later, the doctor called Abby into a treatment room, and right away, Abby told the doctor all about her horrifying symptoms over the past 5 days. The doctor nodded, but admitted he had not seen a case like hers before. The clinic had treated plenty of sailors and fishermen over the years who'd caught odd parasites out at sea, usually from handling old fish carcasses, but those typically affected the intestines, not the eyes. Abby was confused by this. How was it possible that she'd caught something that a local doctor in this area had never treated before? What had Abby done that was so different from the other fishermen? The doctor then had Abby lean back in a reclining chair and swiveled a bright light above her head. Abby squinted while the doctor held her left eye open and gently traced along its edge with a small tool. Then suddenly the doctor froze. Abby tensed as the doctor switched instruments, picking up a small set of tweezers, and then he leaned closer. Abby felt the doctor pluck something from her eye, and then slowly the doctor lifted it towards the light. It was another worm. This one was almost the size of a paperclip. When Abby saw it, she dug her nails into the armrests, totally repulsed. How many of these worms were in her eye? Abby moved to sit up, but the doctor held her down. They were not done. Minutes later, he'd rooted out another worm hiding beneath her eyelid. Abby's mind raced. Where had these worms come from? But even more importantly, why didn't the doctor know what they were or what they were capable of? What if some of these worms had burrowed deeper in towards her brain? Who knew what kind of damage they could cause? The doctor eventually slid his chair back, peeled off his gloves, and sighed deeply. He admitted Abby's situation seemed very serious, but he didn't have the equipment to determine what these creatures were or how to get rid of all of them. Abby's best bet was to fly home and see an eye specialist as soon as possible. Abby agreed, then she stood up, thanked the doctor, and headed back outside. She walked along the sleepy small-town streets in a blur, thinking through every worst-case scenario, from blindness to brain damage to death. She felt invaded, overwhelmed, and totally alone. Abby walked back to the dock and apologized to the captain, but she said she had to go home right now. Then she packed her things and booked the next flight to Oregon. The next afternoon, Abby landed in Portland, Oregon. She walked off the plane and took a taxi straight to the ophthalmology department of Oregon Health and Science University. Her stomach churned with worry, but it felt good to be back in her home state. Abby speed-walked into the huge modern medical complex, signed in, and then asked the nurse to please hurry. She checked her eye with her phone's camera. It was still totally blood red, very puffy, and her upper eyelid was drooping so much, Abby wondered how much longer she'd even be able to open her eye at all. Minutes later, the nurse called her name and took her back to a room where several eye specialists were waiting. Once Abby was in there, she explained each stage of what had happened to her. Her weeks on the boat, the worsening inflammation, all the worms she'd removed. They listened and nodded, while one of them jotted notes. When Abby finished, one of the doctors leaned forward and told her that he had some good news. This was likely nothing. He said that patients often come in thinking they have some sort of parasite or weird insect in their eye, but it was usually just mucus. Abby felt her blood rising. The doctor in Alaska did not pull mucus out of her eye. They were definitely worms. He had even sent them to a lab for analysis. The doctors in the room told Abby to lie back on an operating table. One of them pulled up a chair, clicked on a pen light, and shone it into her left eyeball. Abby steadied her breathing while he inspected her eye. A few minutes later, he clicked the light off and slid the chair back. There was nothing there. He suggested she must have interacted with something on the boat and then maybe touched her eye, but whatever worms she'd contracted were gone now. Abby pleaded with them to please wait a bit and try again. She'd gone to bed last night feeling worms moving around in her eye, so she knew they were still there. And so the doctors exchanged doubtful looks, but agreed to let Abby linger a bit longer since she'd come all the way from Alaska. They all got up and left Abby alone in the examining room. Abby sat there staring up at the ceiling, feeling more and more impatient. For once, she actually wanted the worms to be there. Finally, about half an hour later, she felt one squiggle under her eyelid. She shouted for the doctors who were out in the hallway. They dashed inside, peeled back her left eyelid, leaned in close, searching with the light, and then one of the doctors let out a startled shriek. Abby almost laughed. It obviously was not a good sign for experienced medical professionals to react this way, but at least they were seeing what she was seeing. The doctor removed the worm they just saw and placed it in a sterilized container for testing, and then continued examining Abby's left eye. Within minutes, they'd found another 2 worms. The doctors were buzzing. None of them had ever seen anything like this. They asked Abby loads of questions, but Abby mostly had questions of her own for them. Where had she caught these worms, and how could there be so many? Were they breeding and reproducing in her eye? How dangerous were they? And what if this was just the start of something much, much worse? But the doctors were almost as baffled as Abby, and they couldn't really answer her questions, leaving her feeling scared and frustrated. When the appointment was over, Abby left the building and sat in a patch of grass out front. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on the warmth of the sun, but she could still feel the worms moving beneath her eyelid. The following week, one of the world's leading parasite experts, Dr. Richard Bradbury, strode to the front desk of the CDC's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. The receptionist handed Dr. Bradbury a package marked urgent. Back in his office, he opened up the package and spread the contents across his desk. There was a container with worms preserved in formaldehyde, along with a case report from a pathology clinic on the other side of the country. Parasites were his specialty, so Dr. Bradbury was used to being sent worms and other weird creatures in the mail. But right away, Dr. Bradbury could tell this was an unusual case. These were worms pulled from someone's eye. Dr. Bradbury knew of only one species that fit this description, a rare parasite known as the California eyeworm. It usually only infected smaller mammals like dogs, cats, or sheep, but every once in a while, it found its way into humans. This was worrying. In smaller mammals, the worm's impact was sometimes mild, but occasionally, the worms would lead to cysts or even blindness. But in a human, the potential harm from these worms was mostly unknown. Dr. Bradbury realized Abby might be in serious danger. He also worried that the condition might be contagious. Was it possible she had spread the worms to other people? If so, he needed to act fast. Dr. Bradbury lifted his pen to fill out the case file and write down that he believed it was a California eyeworm, but he hesitated. Alaska was a long way from California, and the California eyeworm really didn't infect humans most of the time. And so the doctor had this nagging feeling that maybe something different had invaded Abby's eye. Dr. Bradbury took the worm sample and crossed the campus to the laboratory. Using a small set of tongs, he placed one of the worms between 2 small squares of glass and then slid that under a microscope. Zooming in, he immediately saw that this was not a California eyeworm. This worm's mouth and genitalia were a different shape, and other body parts were in the wrong places. The longer Dr. Bradbury studied this worm, the more certain he became that this was something he'd never actually encountered before. Which left him wondering, what was this? He was a parasite specialist with decades of experience. If he couldn't identify it, who could? Dr. Bradbury consulted the CDC's massive reference collection, which included hundreds of obscure parasites from all around the world. Thumbing through one catalog after another, none of the worms on file matched the one he'd just seen at the lab. It was time-consuming, tedious work, but Dr. Bradbury had built his career on this kind of attention to detail. Going chronologically, Dr. Bradbury dug past the 50s, the 40s, and into the 30s sifting through every documented parasite the CDC had in its files. His eyes were starting to glaze over when suddenly he stopped. His eyes froze on an unusual scientific drawing. It was dated 1928, and the accompanying text was in German, but the image looked remarkably similar to the sample he had seen under the microscope. The worm in the drawing was absolutely the same as the one from Abby Beckley's eye. But this worm had never been found in a human before, because it was a worm found only in cattle. It was called Thalassia gullosa. These worms live an extremely strange life. They live, mate, and procreate on the surface of a cow's eye. When they produce baby worms, the cow's eye oozes pus to protect itself. Then the flies that kind of hang around the cow step in the pus and drink up some of the baby worms. The baby worms then grow inside the fly until they get too big, and the fly vomits them out, usually into the eye of a different cow. That's how the disease spreads. But in Abby's case, a fly threw up baby worms into her left eye, and they had been living and growing there ever since. The next day, Abby sat in her apartment listening as the doctor from Oregon Health and Science University explained her diagnosis. She slumped back into her couch, totally repulsed. She was relieved they'd finally solved the mystery, but this was so gross. She thought back to the single cow that was on her summer ranch. Abby had often noticed how flies were always swarming all over the cow's eyeballs, but the cow didn't seem to mind or do anything about them. Abby would never think of that lonely old cow the same way again. Abby asked the doctor what the next step was, and the doctor said they had discussed the situation and had actually decided against sending her medicine. Anti-parasitic treatments would definitely kill these worms, but a dead worm might get stuck in Abby's eye and cause permanent scarring. The safest treatment was for Abby to remove the worms herself, one by one, for as long as it took. Abby groaned. This was not the happy ending she'd been hoping for. But she did it. Every time Abby felt a squirming feeling in her eye, she went to the mirror, leaned in, and then pulled the slimy little creature out of her eye with her fingers. Over the next couple of weeks, Abby would remove 8 more worms from her eye, and at that point it seemed like there were none left. In time, Abby would make a full recovery and she would enroll in college to study psychology. However, no matter who she meets, she rarely tells them that one of her claims to fame is being only the 11th person in North American history to be infected by these eyeworms.
In January of 2015, a 27-year-old Texas man named George Pickering III suffered a massive stroke. He was immediately admitted to a hospital where he was put on life support, and then doctors delivered some bad news to his family. It would turn out George was brain dead, and they advised the family that realistically they should consider pulling George off of life support because it wasn't going to do him any good. George's family was totally devastated by this news. In fact, George's father was so upset he just left the hospital altogether. And so in his father's absence, George's mother and brother wound up talking to doctors and saying that yes, we are prepared to pull George off of life support. After they consented to have this done, they put George on an organ donor list and then began making funeral plans. When George's father came back to the hospital later that day and found out his family had consented to have George pulled from life support, he was furious. He did not believe his son was just totally brain dead and there was no hope. He felt like they should at least try to give him a little bit more time to potentially give them a signal that he was okay. But George's mother and brother told George's father that they had spoken to the doctors and there was just no hope. There was no reason to delay this process. It was time. But George's father was totally not having it. He stormed out of the room and he found the doctors and he demanded they keep his son on life support just a little bit longer. But the doctors told him there really is no reason to do that. And in fact, all you're doing is jeopardizing the people that need his organs, that are waiting for this organ transplant. And so really what we need to do is actually expedite taking him off of life support because that's the best thing to do right now. George's father was so upset, totally distraught, he ran back to his son's room, he laid over his son, and he just held his hands and stared at him and just prayed that his son would give him some sign that he was actually not brain dead, but his son didn't. And before long, the doctors began filtering into the room to begin the procedure of removing his son from life support. And when they came in the room, George's father kind of snapped. He ran out of the room, he ran out of the hospital, he went out to his car and he got his gun, and then ran back into the hospital, back into his son's room, and aimed the gun at the doctors and ordered them to stop what they were doing and leave the room immediately. And so the doctors had not actually begun removing George from life support, so he's still on life support. And so once the doctors and everyone left the room, George's father walked over, he locked the door, and then for the next several hours, he just kept his gun aimed at the door as he laid over his son and just kept looking down in hopes that his son would give him some sign that he was not brain dead. And so finally, when the SWAT team arrived and was stacking up outside the door in the hallway, they began yelling into the room for George's father to put the gun down and let them come in. And George's father the whole time is just looking down at his son, hoping and praying that his son is just going to do something. And right as the SWAT team kicks in the door and comes into the room, George's father had reached down and grabbed his son's hand, and his son squeezed his hand back. And as soon as his father felt that, he dropped the gun and he surrendered peacefully to the SWAT team. And then the SWAT team put George's father on the ground. And as he's being detained, George's father is yelling for the doctors to come in the room. My son is okay. And sure enough, when the doctors came in the room, George was okay. He was moving his hand, his eyes were open, he was making good eye contact, and before long, he made a totally full recovery. He would later be told that had his father not stepped in when he did and bought him those extra few hours on life support, George would have died. As for George's father, he was ultimately sentenced to 10 months in prison for his aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, but he and the rest of his family think what he did was certainly worth going to prison for.
Our next story is called Transplant.
When Conrad Rowland was a little kid, he was always on the go. One time when he was at the grocery store with his mother, he leapt out of the cart and ran away from her, and she found him stuck inside of a freezer. After that incident, she literally made him wear bells on his shoes when they were out in public so she didn't lose track of him. But by the time Conrad was just 4 years old, he had discovered athletics. And instead of putting his energy into running away from his mom, he focused it exclusively on baseball, basketball, soccer, and tennis. And by the time he was 11 years old, he was an exceptional all-around athlete. And at the time, his school announced they were going to have this special guest speaker at an assembly, and it turned out to be the Hall of Fame baseball player Rod Carew. And Conrad was just blown away. He just could not believe he was in the presence of an actual professional athlete, let alone a guy that had achieved the success Rod Carew had. And so after this assembly, when he got home, it was all Conrad could talk about, was just how incredible Mr. Carew was and how he, Conrad, was gonna be a professional athlete just like Mr. Carew. For many kids, this would just be a phase. They'd be really invested in sports, and then their interest would go somewhere else, and they'd kind of forget about it, and it would not be their life calling anymore. But for Conrad, the impression Rod Carew left on him was so profound that he never wavered. He really did dedicate himself to becoming a professional athlete, and he would be successful, albeit in a different sport. He became a professional football player in the NFL. And in 2012, Conrad started nearly every game for the New York Jets at tight end. It was like his professional career was going off without a hitch. But in 2013, he injured his knee, which sidelined him for about 2 years. And even though he diligently rehabbed and got back to full strength, the teams were not really ready to take a flyer on him because they were worried his knee would just give out again. He continued to train extremely hard in hopes of landing another contract, but his playing career was starting to look bleak. During the 2016 offseason, Conrad was back home in California visiting his family. One night, as his mother, Mary, was making dinner, Conrad was sitting at the table filling out his driver's license renewal form. And when he got to the section where it asked him if he wanted to be an organ donor, he stopped and he asked his mother, are you an organ donor? And she would say, yeah, I am. And so Conrad said, okay, then I will be too. And he checked the box. And Mary remembers thinking, gosh, I really hope it never comes to that. A few months later, Conrad was working out in a local gym getting ready for the next season when he developed a sudden and severely painful headache. He tried to keep working out, but he just could not do it, so he stepped aside and he called his mom and he told her that he felt this weird click in his head and then he felt this blinding pain behind his left eye. His mother told him he needed to go to the hospital right away. And so that day, Conrad went over to the UCLA Medical Center where they quickly diagnosed him with a brain aneurysm. A brain aneurysm is the bulging or ballooning of a blood vessel in the brain. If the aneurysm bursts, it's fatal about 50% of the time. And for the people who survive a ruptured aneurysm, most likely they will suffer from significant neurological deficits. After his diagnosis, Conrad remained positive and assured his family he was going to kick this thing's butt. But on December 12th, just 4 days after he was admitted, Conrad's aneurysm burst and he never regained consciousness. Because Conrad was an organ donor, the doctors kept his body on life support and they called the recipients at the top of the donor lists. One of them was a man in his 70s who a year earlier had suffered a massive heart attack and desperately needed a new heart. When he and his wife got the call, they were shaking. They couldn't believe it. His life was about to be saved. They already lived right near Los Angeles, so they hopped in their car and they sped to the UCLA Medical Center, and shortly thereafter, news out of the operating room was the transplant had been a success. The man Conrad's heart had just saved was none other than Baseball Hall of Famer Rod Carew, Conrad's childhood hero that had pushed him to become a professional athlete. At first, the families had no idea, but eventually this incredible link was discovered and immediately the two families bonded. Today, because Conrad's family only lives 12 miles away from Rod Carew and his family, Conrad's mother was given a standing invitation by the Carews to stop by anytime she wanted to listen to her son's heart.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Maneuver.
On the morning of August 1st, 2009, 44-year-old skydiving instructor David Hartsock pulled into the parking lot of Skydive Houston in Texas and then made his way inside. A few minutes later, and Dave, like the rest of his colleagues, was hard at work getting ready for the day before the facility opened up and the inevitable weekend rush began. Skydive Houston is actually just a private airport, and it's not really in Houston. It's located about 30 miles to the northwest of Houston in a city called Waller. The main facility of Skydive Houston is situated right up against this huge open airfield that basically looks like a big green grass field. And the main facility itself is comprised of several large buildings, one of which is a huge hangar that contains the Super Twin Otter airplanes, which are the little aircraft that bring the skydivers up so they can jump out. Because Skydive Houston offers something called tandem jumping, it gets a lot of first-time jumpers. Tandem jumping is when a skydiving student attaches to the front of their instructor. Literally, they're buckled onto them, and then the two of them leap out of the plane together, with the student never detaching from the instructor. This method allows the student to just kind of go along for the ride and have no responsibility, while the instructor who's attached to them does everything. They make sure they're both stable in the air, they're the ones that pull the ripcord to deploy the chute, they're the ones that land them safely on the ground. And so obviously, tandem jumping really appeals to first-time jumpers. Dave had finished his 3-year-long training course to become a certified skydiving instructor just a few months earlier. But even prior to going through this course, Dave was already a very experienced skydiver with over 800 jumps to his credit. And the reason he had so many jumps is because Dave loved skydiving. It had given his life a focus that really nothing else ever had. Dave had always been a kind of average guy. He lived in a very modest house in a suburb of Houston, and for much of his life, he had worked very normal blue-collar jobs, like he had been a cook at 2 different chain restaurants, he had managed a grocery store, and he also had worked at a soda bottling plant. Dave was divorced and had no kids, but he had a really good group of friends who liked to go to bars and go bowling and play darts. And while Dave was never really unhappy with the way his life was going, as he started to creep into his 40s, he couldn't help but think, I haven't really done anything big or important in my life. And so, in 2004, not long after Dave got divorced, one of his good friends asked him if he wanted to go skydiving with him to celebrate that friend's 40th birthday. And Dave immediately thought to himself, this is it. This is a chance to do something big with my life. And so he told the friend, yes, I'd love to go. And after that first jump that Dave did with his friend, Dave was hooked. Whenever Dave was falling through the sky at over 100 miles per hour, it was like nothing else in the whole world even existed. Life became very simple and beautiful. The manager at Skydive Houston saw Dave come in every weekend for years to do all these jumps, and finally, he just offered Dave a job. And so that was how Dave left the soda bottling plant to become a skydiving instructor. So, August 1st, 2009 was a Saturday, and Saturdays at Skydive Houston were incredibly busy with basically non-stop tandem jumps all day. Whenever Dave was not working, so he was jumping on his own, he would always pack his own parachute because, like many other skydivers, he liked to make sure it was done exactly right. But when Dave was working, especially on Saturdays when it was so crazy busy, he didn't have time to pack and repack his parachute after every single jump because he was constantly being sent up again and again and again to take another student. And so instead, he would take one of the pre-packed parachutes that were left out for instructors inside of their clubhouse. That particular Saturday in August of 2009 went very quickly, with Dave going up one after another with different students and jumping out and pulling the chute and landing safely over and over again. And then finally, at the end of the day, right around 4 o'clock, when Dave was getting ready to be done for the day, his manager came up to him and said, "Hey, do you mind doing one more tandem jump?" And even though Dave was really exhausted, he's dripping sweat, it's super hot outside, he'd done 6 jumps that day, which was a lot, he said, no problem. And so the manager introduced Dave to a short blonde woman who was visibly nervous named Shirley Diggert, who was there to celebrate her 54th birthday by skydiving for the first time. Her husband, her son, and her 3 grandkids were also there to watch her from the ground and take pictures, and her other son, who was celebrating his 30th birthday, he too was going skydiving. As soon as Dave walked up to Shirley, he grinned and stuck out his hand, and he made the same kind of corny joke he always made with nervous first-time jumpers, and that was, "Don't worry, you're going to be just fine. You're going to be strapped to me, and I'm not about to let anything happen to myself." And so Shirley laughed, and she did seem like she was a little bit at ease. And so Dave patted her on the shoulder, and then he walked over and he grabbed one of the pre-packed parachutes off the wall. These chutes actually contained 2 parachutes inside of the backpack. There was the main chute, which typically is the only chute that gets deployed on a jump, and then there was the reserve chute, which is a little bit smaller and is not normally used unless there's some sort of emergency where the main chute fails. After every jump, because the main chute has been deployed, it gets repacked and stuffed back into the backpack. But the reserve chute, because it almost never gets deployed, just stays packed. And so Skydive Houston, like basically every other skydiving facility, has certified technicians come in periodically to test the reserve chutes inside of the bag to make sure they're still packed exactly right. After grabbing the pre-packed parachute off the wall, Dave walked back over to Shirley, who was now in the staging area putting on her flight suit. A flight suit is a single garment, kind of looks like a big onesie for an adult. And so Dave walked over, he put the parachute down, he tugged and pulled on her flight suit to make sure it was good, and then after he was satisfied, he picked the parachute back up and he signaled to Shirley, as well as Shirley's son, who was also skydiving, to follow him. And so the trio, they left the staging area, they went outside right to the airfield where there was a Super Twin Otter idling and other jumpers were climbing on board to go for a jump. And so Dave, Shirley, and Shirley's son got in line, they boarded the plane, and a few minutes later, they were airborne. As the plane slowly climbed up to 13,500 feet, which is the jumping altitude, Shirley was sitting directly in front of Dave. They were on a bench seat on the back right of this little airplane, and Dave made a point of talking to Shirley and asking her where she was from and what she did to kind of ease her nerves. Shirley would tell Dave that this was not the kind of thing that she typically did. In fact, she told Dave that her other son, who was jumping with them, when he first decided he wanted to try skydiving a year earlier, she had desperately tried to talk him out of it, saying it was too dangerous. But recently, Shirley and her husband had decided that they needed to be more adventurous. They lived in a quiet town in rural Texas where Shirley was a mail carrier and her husband worked in a mine, and their lives were just kind of simple and very routine-oriented and kind of boring. So when Shirley's son, who was skydiving with them that day, had asked Shirley to go skydiving on her 54th birthday, she saw it as an opportunity to break the mold and do something adventurous, and so she said yes. And so Dave told Shirley about how he had discovered skydiving much the same way she had, and they really bonded over that. About 20 minutes after takeoff, all the tandem jumpers on the plane were now attached to their instructors, so Shirley was now buckled onto Dave. And then when they reached 13,500 feet, the jumping altitude, one of the instructors slid open the side door. It was time to jump. And the first one who was jumping was Shirley's son. And so from all the way back in the plane, Shirley called out to her son, "Have a good jump, I'll see you on the ground," as her son kind of waddled to the edge of the door with his instructor, and the two of them jumped out and disappeared into the air below. Next up was Shirley. So Dave told Shirley very calmly to stand up, and so they did. They stood up right next to their bench, and then before they waddled towards the exit, Dave, for what felt like the millionth time, checked to make sure he really was securely fastened onto Shirley, and then Dave tapped his ripcord right behind him, kind of like muscle memory, reminding himself where to go. He tapped his knife on his shoulder. He kind of just felt his equipment, and then feeling ready, he said, "Okay, Shirley, let's go." And then the two of them kind of waddled their way towards the front of the plane where that door was slid wide open, and then they turned, so Shirley's feet were right on the edge, basically looking out into the sky right outside. And so it's really loud, it's very windy, and Dave is right in Shirley's ear saying, "Okay, I'm going to count to 3 and we're going to jump." And then Dave reached forward, he pulled Shirley's head back so she was looking up because he didn't want her to look down when they leapt out, because for some people that will cause them to panic when they see the ground. And so with Shirley's head back, Dave very calmly said 1, 2, 3, and then very gracefully, the two of them jumped out. From the moment you jump out of a plane at 13,500 feet until you touch the ground, it takes maybe 2 to 3 minutes with about 30 seconds to a minute of actual freefall. But that 2 to 3 minutes is so intense, it feels like it's 20 minutes long. And this was what Dave loved so much about skydiving, that intense presence you feel, that you're really in the moment. There's nothing else you can think about. It's just you careening through the sky towards the earth. It's incredible. Dave had actually had a number of close calls in his life. Like a few years earlier, he had been riding his motorcycle when somebody hit him in their car and he fractured his skull. And then not long after that accident, he was in another accident where he fractured his spine. And after each of those 2 accidents and a few others, the only thought in Dave's mind was, "Oh my goodness, I hope I can skydive again." And miraculously, he had been. He had made full recoveries, and he was back to skydiving each time. And so now, whenever he jumped out of a plane, he just felt so lucky. The plan for that evening's jump was for Dave to rotate them 360 degrees 3 separate times so Shirley could get a full look down across Houston and all over Texas and just kind of see the world around her from so high up in the air. And then, whenever Dave noticed that they were at 5,000 feet using his wrist altimeter, which is basically like a watch that tells you how far you are from the ground, Dave would pull the ripcord, the main chute would deploy, and they would float gently down to the ground. And at first, that is how this jump went. After they exited the plane, they stabilized in the proper horizontal position with Shirley in front, her stomach pointing toward the ground, and Dave obviously right behind her, controlling the skydive. And then after a few seconds, Dave slightly changed his body position and began rotating them 360 degrees so Shirley could look down and see all the highways and cars and barns and houses and the city off in the distance. I mean, it's this spectacular view. And as you're falling through the sky, especially in the first few seconds of a jump, you can't tell that you're going super fast. but you're going over 120 miles an hour, which is called terminal velocity. It's literally the fastest you can fall in the air. And so you're blazing towards the ground, but it almost feels like the air is pushing you back up. And so Shirley's having this incredible first-time experience, just really taking it all in. And Dave, even though he had done this hundreds of times, was having a wonderful time as well. But Dave really was just focused on his altimeter, because when they hit 5,000 feet, he needed to pull the parachute. And so they're cruising along, Dave's checking his altimeter over and over again, and then finally he sees 5,000 feet, he quickly looks around him to scan for any other jumpers, he's clear, and so he reached back and he pulled his ripcord handle for his main chute. Now, normally, when you deploy your main parachute, depending on what kind of parachute you're using, there's actually kind of a slow unfurling. It's not like suddenly the chute is deployed and then you just stop. That would not work. You'd get destroyed every time you skydive. So the way it's packed is it kind of unfurls slowly, and it's like a gradual slowing down. But after Dave has pulled the ripcord handle, there was an immediate yank of the parachute backpack up and away from him, and then from somewhere above him, he heard a loud popping sound. Now, Dave had jumped enough times to know that this was not normal. There was a problem, and he would be right. The main parachute had deployed out of the backpack, but it got tangled on the way out, and so it did not inflate at all, and so as a result, it was not slowing them down at all. But worse than that was this tangled up parachute was still attached to them, and it kind of became like a sail. And it turned Dave and Shirley onto their sides and began whipping them around in something called a death spiral, where literally you're just spinning so unbelievably fast that normally jumpers will actually lose consciousness. They're spinning so fast. But Dave, being a very experienced skydiver, he tried to stay calm. He tried to track his way out of this death spiral, which is when you put your arms and legs straight and try to go in a straight line through the air. But it didn't work. He just kept on spinning faster and faster. And at this point, Shirley, she's practically losing consciousness. She's yelling what's going on. And Dave is just trying to stay calm. He's still trying to get out of it, but he knows there's no way. But Dave remembers he has 2 knives. And so he decides he's going to cut away this tangled main chute and then deploy his reserve chute, because you don't want to open your reserve directly into a tangled parachute. And so he reaches up, he's spinning, remember, he reaches up and he grabs the first knife. However, the lines of the tangled parachute had actually tangled on his shoulder strap where that first knife was. And so he literally couldn't get to the knife. And so now they're below 5,000 feet. They're at like 4,000, closing in on 3,000 feet. I mean, they're coming close to the ground here, and they don't have a canopy. But Dave, he stays calm. They're spinning around. He can't get that first knife. And so he reaches for the second knife, which was placed in front of Shirley. But because of how quickly they were spinning, he couldn't quite get his arm out to grab the second knife. It was just impossible to grab it. And so, without any other options, Dave had to pull his reserve chute, knowing it was going to go straight into this tangled mess right above them. And so the reserve chute, it deploys, and it does work, at least at first. There's that gradual slowing down sensation that Dave immediately feels. Their spin begins to stop, and for a second, it seems like they're going to be saved by this reserve chute, because by now, they're only about 2,000 feet from the ground. However, the worst case scenario happens to Dave and Shirley. As soon as their reserve chute was up over their head, inflated, their main chute suddenly caught air and inflated as well. So they had 2 parachutes. Now, you can land with 2 parachutes, absolutely. However, sometimes in a worst case scenario, the 2 parachutes will catch wind going in opposite directions. So basically the parachutes will go out to either side of the jumper or jumpers if it's tandem. And then you basically have wings that aim the jumpers straight at the ground. It's like an accelerant. It causes them to literally speed up straight towards the ground. And once you start moving in this position, which is known as a down plane, it's almost impossible to get out of it, because the faster you go, the more inflated these 2 parachutes become. And so Dave knows they are less than 2,000 feet from the ground. They're in a down plane, which is almost always fatal. And so all he can do is try to get out of the down plane. And so Dave, with all his might, he begins yanking on the different lines of both parachutes, and he manages to get them out of the downplane, which is nearly impossible to do. He does it. And then both parachutes collapse. And suddenly, Dave and Shirley have no parachute, they're less than 1,000 feet from the ground, and they are falling once again over 100 miles per hour straight down to the earth. Now, at this moment, Shirley is crying, she's screaming, she doesn't know what's going on, and Dave has this incredible sense of calm come over him. Years ago, Dave had given up on the idea of ever having a family or of having kids. He was a really good guy who would have been a great father, but it just wasn't in the cards for him. Instead, Dave had found skydiving. Oftentimes, Dave would stay late at Skydive Houston and just sit around the campfire with the other instructors and the other jumpers and drink beers and eat burgers and tell stories. And sometimes Dave would even sleep the night at Skydive Houston because he didn't want to go back home to his empty 3-bedroom house where all he wanted to do when he was there was go skydiving again. But now, literally staring down his own death, knowing that it's going to happen any second, the only thing he could think about was Shirley. He didn't care if he died. He felt like he had found his calling. If he died doing it, so be it. But Shirley, her husband, her son on the ground, her son skydiving, her 3 grandkids, they're going to see Shirley hit the ground and die. He just couldn't handle it. He thought, I have to do something to protect Shirley. And with only a few hundred feet to the ground, Dave yelled to Shirley, "Tuck your knees up." And Shirley immediately did it. She threw her knees up, and as she did, Dave pulled back as hard as he possibly could on the risers and the toggles in an attempt to switch places with Shirley. Shirley was in front of him. Her body's going to hit the ground first. Dave flipped them around so that his back was going to hit the ground first. He was going to sacrifice himself to maybe save Shirley. When they hit the ground, people a quarter mile away heard their impact. And when they hit the ground, all of Shirley's family saw it. Everybody saw it. They went running over to the crash site. And when they got there, there was this tangle of bodies and this parachute. And as they're staring at it, they watched one of the bodies move. It was Shirley. She was alive. After paramedics arrived, they cut her off of Dave's body and they rushed her to the hospital where she had serious injuries, several broken vertebrae, and very significant internal injuries, but none of them were life-threatening. She would survive. However, 3 days after arriving in the hospital, Shirley got devastating news. Dave had been rushed to the hospital as well right after Shirley had, but he finally had succumbed to his injuries and passed away. Dave's last-ditch maneuver had worked. He had saved Shirley's life at the cost of his own. However, not long after Shirley and her family found out about Dave's death, They got another call, and this time it was to tell them that the news about Dave's death was premature. He was not dead. However, he was paralyzed from the neck down. A few weeks later, after Shirley got out of the hospital, she immediately went to the intensive care unit where Dave was being treated to see him for the first time since their accident. And when she saw him, he was sitting in a wheelchair covered in tubes and wires, and she just stood there looking at him. And Dave, when he saw Shirley, he just started to cry. At this point, Shirley walked up to him, she gave him a hug, and she said, "I love you." Today, Dave and Shirley are still friends. Shirley has recovered completely because of Dave's heroic act. Dave, on the other hand, remains paralyzed and only has a little bit of feeling in his right arm. He now lives in Texas with his mother, who looks after him full time, and they desperately need our support. My family has already made a donation to his GoFundMe page, and I hope some of you will do the same thing. You can find his GoFundMe page in the description below, and after speaking with him, he assured me that all of the donation money is being used to take care of himself. He has a lot of care that he needs, his mom can't do it alone, and so anything we give them is just making his life a little bit easier.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt.